Chapter 2. Domestic Robot Problems. 6 months later, Franklin found himself visiting Croxon Club more frequently than he used to. Croxon Club was a place for people in Abbott City of all interdimensional races to unwind. The club was named after its owner, who thought spelling everything with a K was clever. But that wasn't why people from dimensions all over the multiverse went there. They went because Croxon had drinks you couldn't get anywhere else, like the Threatnoidian Dragonfly. Franklin didn't know a thing about it, beyond that it was made in a dimension called Threatnoidia, and he didn't have the slightest idea what was in it. It tasted good and it gave him a buzz, and that's all that really mattered. And since, after having the same drink every week for the last 4 years, his eyes hadn't popped out of his sockets and he hadn't imploded, he wasn't too worried about it. Most people also didn't come for the entertainment. At the moment, a pair of Quacksword twins from the Bramsit dimension was on stage doing a hideous karaoke rendition of I Will Survive. They sounded like a herd of cows. Their deep, droning voices would have made them sound like only 2 cows had they only had 1 head apiece, but since there were 6 between them, they sounded like an entire herd. If I owned this place, I'd hold auditions before I let anyone with that many heads on stage, said a voice next to him. Franklin turned his head to see his best friend and colleague, William Vanderhorst, who was wearing a red Hawaiian shirt with an orange tie. It was the same thing he had worn to work. I didn't expect to see you here this evening, said Franklin, shaking his hand. All William seemed to talk about lately was video games, and Franklin had figured he'd be at home playing. But he was glad for the company. Still working on Final Fantasy? Or is it Castlevania now? Nah, I borrowed one from a patient of mine who occasionally vacations in Dimension .485. Franklin nodded. Dimension .485 was one of the closer alternate Earth realities. Most of the history was exactly the same. Lincoln had still been murdered, the Allies had still won World War II, the Star Wars prequel trilogy was still awful, but some things changed a little. So what's this new game you're playing? Franklin asked. Bounce Destruction Mayhem. It's a cross between Super Mario, Tekken 3, and Pogo Sticks. Franklin raised an eyebrow. Pogo Sticks? William took a seat next to Franklin. So, how were things at work? Franklin was used to pretending he wasn't having any trouble with his patients, but the truth was he spent all his free time reading up on the culture and behaviors of the species of each new patient, and sometimes that was barely enough. He often felt like a calculus teacher who never made it past college algebra. I'm getting a new patient tomorrow, Franklin said. A human. Young guy. Regular case of realizing how screwed up the world is. William took a sip from his glass. His drink was the color of mustard and was almost of the same consistency. Franklin didn't think it looked very appetizing, and he found himself less curious about its composition than he was about the Threatnoidian Dragonfly. Do you mean he's finally coming to terms with the fact that most governments are corrupt and people get murdered a lot, or the other kind of screwed up? Oh, no, the other one. I'm not sure what he's seen, but whatever it is, my secretary said he sounded pretty traumatized. What about you? The twins had finished singing, and the audience was quietly and politely applauding. Franklin and William sat down their glasses, lightly clapped 3 or 4 times each, and resumed drinking. Oh, I got a patient with phantastophobia, said William, smiling proudly. Franklin almost choked on his drink. Phantastophobia was the fear of too many things going one's way. He had read about it, but he was always suspicious about whether it actually existed. Yeah, it's fascinating. I can't talk about a specific case, of course, William said. Of course. But it turns out he was just fine when everything was going wrong, but now that things are perfect, he's getting emotionally unstable. It's a good thing he found us, said Franklin. Otherwise, he might have been put on medicine or something. William shuddered at that and took a long drink from his mustard-like beverage. Medicine. I think it's created half the mental conditions it was supposedly designed to relieve. I wish more Earth doctors would take a page from our book, Franklin said. Of course, they'd have to admit there were such things as other dimensions. And if they did that, you and I would probably have more work than we could handle. Franklin laughed and raised his drink. To the multiverse, he said. They clanked their glasses together. And to the best job in this dimension, William added. Or at least the most interesting. And Franklin couldn't argue with that. Normal is a word that is in no way whatsoever worth bothering to define, Franklin told his new patient, Calvin Stanley. Their session had just begun, and Calvin had already asked him to define normal. Franklin knew their conversation wasn't likely to end well. Even the attempt at developing an opinion on the subject has driven more people mad than any actual mental illness. If normal could truly be defined, then normal would seem extremely abnormal, except we wouldn't call it abnormal, we'd call it normal. Calvin looked confused. And since this is a concept we can hardly wrap our minds around, we must simply accept that anything can and does happen. Logic is always logical except for when it isn't, and if it doesn't seem possible, it probably wasn't before it happened. This was Franklin's best explanation, one he had practiced in front of the mirror when his wife wasn't home a dozen times, and one which he would readily admit wasn't much of an explanation at all. But considering that he lived in a world where the majority of people either chose to ignore that portals opened somewhere every day, or were too stupid to notice, there wasn't much else he could say, certainly nothing very comforting. What is normal? It was one of his least favorite questions, and he was used to getting less than positive reactions to his answer. He really needed to work on that speech, especially when dealing with someone like Calvin, who had just found out his mother was a robot. Calvin was a short, single, well-dressed, well-groomed tax preparer who spent the majority of his time reading encyclopedias and competing in Scrabble championships. He was the worst sort of person to suddenly learn that his mother was a robot. "Mom's a robot," he said for the 5th time, dumbfounded and blinking a lot. "And you find that difficult to accept," said Franklin. "How is it even possible? I didn't know there were robots, much less that they were having children, much less even that they were having me." "Stranger things have happened," Franklin said. He immediately wished he could gobble the words back up the moment he said them. "Like what?" Calvin asked. He folded his arms and looked out at the city through Franklin's massive office window. "I don't think you really want me to answer that," said Franklin. "No, really, I do. What could possibly be weirder than being the son of a freaking robot? First of all, she may be a robot, but she's still your mother. And no, you don't want to know. At least not yet. Take it one step at a time. But while you're getting used to the idea, it's very important that you don't tell anyone. Not like they believe me anyway. Most people wouldn't know. But trust me, for your own sake. Your mother is an HR 120. A what? Human Replica Model 120. That means 2 very important things for you. First, she can do absolutely anything and everything a human being can do. I know that much. What's the other thing? If she finds out you know, she's programmed to kill you. Calvin went wide-eyed and froze. Oh, I thought you were a therapist, not a sci-fi enthusiast. It isn't science fiction, Franklin said. It's the truth. It's my job to know these things. If I didn't, I couldn't help you, and half the problems my patients have would probably be just as traumatic for me. The first step in helping you cope with this situation is to make sure you don't do anything to get yourself killed. Franklin told Calvin about the HR 120s, how they posed as real people all over the world, and how no one knew just how many of them there were or who built them. Vlachtermat's intelligence on them was extremely limited. Since they could do anything a human being could, it was impossible to tell how many of them there were. From a few recorded incidents, all Franklin and the staff at Vlachtermat knew was that the HR 120s would go to any lengths to conceal their existence from the world. So I guess that means I'm not, no, said Franklin. You're not a robot. As I said, the HR 120s can do anything a human can do. That includes having human children. That's weird. They're incredibly sophisticated. How did you find out about her? Calvin stood up and started pacing the bright blue carpeted floor. Franklin picked up his clipboard and began writing as Calvin spoke. He wasn't really taking any notes, but he found that it usually made his patients feel better to think he was. She started malfunctioning, said Calvin. I came home to visit and she made dinner. Halfway through her tuna casserole, she asked me how things were going at work. I told her, she nodded, and then she asked again. I asked her if everything was all right, but she just ignored me and asked a third time. She kept repeating the same question for 10 minutes before she finally snapped out of it and went back to her tuna. Franklin looked up from his clipboard. And you surmised that she must be a robot just from that? No, said Calvin. A couple hours later, I peeked into her room and saw her unscrewing a panel on her arm with a screwdriver. That would do it. Franklin rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Mr. Stanley, I have an exercise I would like you to try. Calvin leaned forward. I'll do anything. Leave the country. What? Your mother is not only an HR 120, she is apparently a broken HR 120. I have no idea what she might do to you when she sees you next. As if on cue, Franklin's thick glass office door opened. Standing behind it was a tall, brown-haired, middle-aged woman wearing a stunning red dress and heels with her arms folded in front of her. Calvin stepped back from the door. Mom, what are you doing here? It was Virginia Stanley, the HR 120 herself. I've been looking for you, she said. We need to talk. Franklin immediately stood between them, staring Mrs. Stanley squarely in the face. No one is going to die in my office. I specialize in domestic disputes. Let's settle this calmly. Mrs. Stanley raised her hand and swatted Franklin to the ground like an abnormally large fly. Then she grabbed her son by the throat. Now, what did I say, Mrs. Stanley? Franklin said from the floor, coughing. You said there would be no death in your office. Unfortunately for you, Asimov's 3 laws of robotics are complete bunk. I was not programmed by a human, I am not programmed to obey humans, and I am not programmed to permit useless therapists to solve my domestic disputes. I am, however, programmed to do this. The HR 120 proceeded calmly and unmercifully to squeeze her son's throat more tightly. HR 120s had 3 times the strength of humans. Franklin couldn't hope to save Calvin by himself, and Calvin's windpipe would be crushed in seconds. Franklin looked up at his desk and remembered a security protocol he'd never thought he'd need. He struggled to get off the floor, and then he reached for a drawer behind the desk. He pulled out a small red leather book and frantically paged through it until he found what he needed, the positronic deactivation switch. Then he got up into his chair and pressed a small button on his desk. It flashed red and beeped. He shouted the security code for the positronic deactivation switch, code Alpha 392, hoping the HR 120 was too distracted with Calvin to pay any attention. When security heard that code, they would activate a device that would send a signal to shut down any positronic activity, anything with an artificially intelligent brain in the building. After 5 more seconds of watching Calvin writhe in pain and struggle for oxygen, Virginia Stanley opened her hand and let him fall unceremoniously to the floor. He was dead. She turned to face Franklin, who was still bent over his desk. You know I'm an HR 120? She asked. Her arms transformed into 2 enormous, sleek, metallic guns. That's kind of obvious by now, said Franklin. What was taking security so long to turn on the switch? She should have already been deactivated. Just checking. Now I am authorized to kill you. No hard feelings. She lifted one of her strange weapon arms. A line of green lights on the sides of each gun flashed rapidly, and Franklin looked around frantically, wondering in which direction was the smartest to jump. But he never had to make that decision because the guns didn't fire. Virginia froze, and after several seconds, she dropped to the floor. The lights on her weapon arms stopped flashing. Her eyes went blank. It's about time, Franklin said aloud. He left his office and stormed over to his secretary's desk. Sorry the positronic deactivation protocol took so long, boss, said Bethany. The place has never been infiltrated by robots before. The security guys had no idea what code Alpha 392 was. They had to look it up. Franklin's face went red with fury. Nothing like this had ever happened in his 5 years at Vlachtermat. My patient died, Bethany. Oh. Finding out his mom was a robot must have been too much for him. No, his mom was too much for him. Franklin put both hands on her desk and leaned forward angrily. How the hell did an HR 120 get into this building? The lady I sent in was an HR 120? But she came in here yesterday, remember? You booked her appointment. She was your 1 o'clock. He slammed one of his fists down on her desk and instantly felt bad about it. He shouldn't have been taking this out on Bethany. Despite how insensitive she wasn't to blame. He remembered Virginia now. She had looked different with gun turrets for arms, which made Calvin's death not only extremely depressing, but also Franklin's fault. He turned to leave. It's not like you could have known what she was. I mean, only a telepath could possibly know if a person wore an HR 120. Franklin turned back and narrowed his eyes. Bethany looked away and pulled out some paperwork. Sorry. Still a touchy subject. Okay, got it. He sighed and turned away again. There's always time travel, Bethany called behind him. I almost got fired last time, remember? So I guess I'll cancel all your appointments for this afternoon? I guess so, he answered, and walked into the elevator.